Hello and welcome to my second ever two-part Inanimate Insanity video. This time, it's not due to my incredibly slow pacing issues. Instead, it's because of this month's episode being a two-parter. And despite this segment being shorter than a usual episode, there's still a good amount for us to talk about. This episode's gimmick was personality swapping, and what I find funny is that the last Object Show episode I've seen use this concept was BFDI. And in that episode, the personality swapping concept was essentially the main focus. Each team had to find out which contestants had their personality swapped. The team that failed to find their imposter lost. But the problem with it was that the idea wasn't played around with very much. Each personality swapped contestant had no more than a minute of screen time. There was very little effort put into having them try to deceive the others, and it just made the whole episode feel extremely underdeveloped. Whereas in this episode, the personality swapping is more of something that was added to the challenge to make it a lot more interesting. But the whole idea is much more fleshed out. You got a lot more character interactions and people fumbling around trying to get used to their new bodies. So much so that the challenge seems to be more of a supplement to the body swapping, which I vastly preferred because it made for a very enjoyable segment. It was a bit of a letdown to not see Nickel or Bo body swapped, but in retrospect it makes sense. So far, Bo's main thing in this episode seems to be her having an identity crisis, and I feel like her being in someone else's body would not make things better for her. And since everyone had to be paired against someone else, having Nickel not join in on the group photo of death definitely made sense for him. Speaking of which, that photo sure is making me continue to think about what's going on with Test Tube and Bo. Really something I want to know more about. Hopefully part 2 will have some answers. I'll list off some highlights. Ballpoint Pen was a nice new character. He's not Steve Cobbs, but hey, I'll take him. I love how much of a hard time he gives Miphone, and despite looking like an overstretched sunflower seed, he's got some style. I also really like how the body swapped contestants were chosen. They're all like the perfect choices. Switching Paintbrush, the most on-edge, irritable contestant with the floor, the most laid-back and easygoing contestant, was really funny to see, especially with how much the floor flails around with Paintbrush's body. Clover switching with Test Tube was really interesting since Clover's body seems to retain her luck, and that allowed Clover to spend some time luckless. Clover's body was also a really clever excuse to accidentally destroy Bo's folder, which was a fun gag, but man, Bo needs a break at some point. And Balloon switching with Goo worked surprisingly well, since at first glance it felt like the two of them were really similar. They both have very nice, wholesome attitudes, so switching their personalities didn't sound super interesting, but Balloon and Goo's body worked surprisingly well. He's got a fun edge that Goo doesn't quite have, and seeing Goo using his newfound arms to emote just brings me so much newfound joy. Yin Yang switch wasn't made apparent, which was kind of weird to me, but I'm guessing that they just switch with each other. It's kind of weird that they didn't show us that though, and I have no idea how they're gonna handle that in part 2. There's an odd number of contestants and it seems that everyone has to go up against someone, so how do they race against each other when they share the same body? But also something that's really funny to me is that they actually had a really cleverly written excuse for why they had to make this episode a two-parter. I like to imagine that Goo and Balloon are still racing to the center as we speak. But yeah, it was overall a very solid segment. Super excited to see how this episode will conclude. So, see you all in part 2.